Okay, good evening, everyone. Nice to be able to see everyone who's here. I have had a little laser surgery on my eye, so I can see now once again. Believe me, it's a big improvement what I had before. All right. We'll start, of course, with a little bit of this week's coming Torah portion, Parshat Truma. And Parshat Truma begins with a commandment to Israel to take up a collection of gifts. Talk to the Israelite people to bring me gifts. You shall accept gifts for me from every person whose heart so moves him. These are the gifts that you shall accept from them: gold, silver, and copper, blue, purple, and crimson yarns, fine linen, goat's hair, tanned ram skins. They're translating is dolphin skins. It's not clear what that is. Acacia wood, oil for lighting, spices for anointing oil, and the aromatic incense, lapis lazuli, and other stones for setting for the ephod and the breastpiece, and to make a sanctuary that I may dwell among them. Exactly as I show you the pattern of the tabernacle and the pattern of all its furnishings, so shall you make it. Okay, this is the opening of Parshat Truma. And the last part, for the most part, what we're going to read in the rest of the book of Exodus, Sefer Shemot, is going to be concerned with the tabernacle, the Mishkan. In Hebrew, it's called Mishkan because the word means to dwell. God is seen as dwelling in the Mishkan. It's like his home away from home. A portable tabernacle, although when we read through it, how it's constructed, it has wooden walls, it has various materials are used for the roofing, and then it has a court that's enclosed with hangings. And then there's outside of the Mishkan, outside the actual tabernacle, there's a place for there's an altar, again, portable. Inside this tent, this Mishkan, there will be a menorah, the 7-branch menorah. There will be a table for what is called showbread. And this was bread that was baked and then placed in the tabernacle and replaced every Shabbat afternoon. A table for burning of incense, screen that screens off the Holy of Holies, and inside the Holy of Holies is where the Ark of the Covenant with the Cherubim, the Cherubim on top of it. This was the basic plan of the tabernacle. When scholars look at it, they see it as meant to represent God's home. There's a table, there's a lamp, there's an incense, often was found in the ancient world. God was pictured, at least biblically, but in the minds of the rabbis as well, that above the ark were 2 Cherubim. In English, you call it cherubim. Cherubim is merely the Hebrew word karuv, Cherubim, the plural. They're bending towards each other with their wings stretching towards each other. And the description is as if God speaks to Moses from where those two sets of wings come together. It's pictured by some as a footstool of God, becomes the place that God speaks to Moses. Now, this idea of a temple, place to worship God, to worship through sacrifices, which was the normative way of worshiping gods in the ancient world. And so it's not at all unexpected that Israel would be commanded to build such a thing. And it serves as the pattern for the temple that's built in Jerusalem, first one by Solomon, and then later by the return of the exiles, and then the most magnificent of them all, the one that was built by King Herod to replace the less splendid temple of the return of the exiles that was destroyed finally by the Romans in the year 70 of the Common Era. modern critics, instead of seeing the temple being patterned on the tabernacle, suggests that later generations read into the biblical account a Mishkan, a tent, portable tent, that paralleled what they had. In other words, either the Mishkan was the pattern for the future, which is the traditional understanding of it, or, as Bible critics are wont to do, they want to say that often we have stuff read back into the earlier layers of the Bible, especially into the Torah, in which case the later temples becomes the model for the Mishkan, the tabernacle. So it depends on how you approach things. The various elements of it, gold and silver, the closer it was to the divine, the more precious the materials. One of the things that's also very interesting, not only in the construction of the tabernacle, but also later on in the clothing of the priests. One of the things the Torah says you're not supposed to do is to mix wool with linen threads. They make garments as a combination of wool, which comes from an animal, and linen, which is a plant derivative. And that was forbidden. However, the Kohen, especially the high priest, and parts of the tabernacle were made explicitly from a mixture of wool and linen. So you have, how that fits in together, different ways of interpreting it. Maybe because it was reserved for the priests. That's why the ordinary Israelite was not supposed to have that kind of garment. Or it was to suggest that for the temple, for the sacrificial system, that ban did not apply, and therefore it didn't hold in the Mishkan. There's special rules and regulations for the tabernacle. Whichever the case may be, that's what we read about this week. Next week, we talk about the priests themselves, the garments, the fancy schmancy garments of the Kohanim, especially the high priest. Especially in the Catholic Church, a lot of the paraphernalia of the priests was modeled on some of the descriptions that we find in the Torah of how the priests were supposed to be dressed. Okay, so as I said, we're going to be spending a lot of time the next few Shabbatot on the tabernacle until it's finally erected, and then we eventually read about how God was said to come in, contract himself, as it were, to be present in the Mishkan as a symbol of God's being with Israel. And the Israelite encampment eventually was set up so that the tabernacle was in the middle. And then on all four sides, 3 tribes living on each one of the 4 sides, with the Levites in the middle surrounding the tabernacle. Okay. All right. So we're going to continue with our Hebrew tonight. So I'm going to, just a second here. Oh, okay. No, that's the end of what we're going to do. Okay. Okay, unmute yourselves. We are familiar with the letter Shin, an SH. The letter Sin looks exactly the same, only the dot is on the left side. All right. One of the ways of remembering that that's an S sound instead of an SH sound is that in Latin, sinister means left. And so the left, if it's on the left, it's an S. I don't know if that helps you any or not, but that's the case. So we're still working on the second bracha that we say on Hanukkah, okay, so this is always going to be an S sound. If the dot's on the right-hand side, it will be an SH sound. So if everybody has unmuted themselves. All right, unmute, okay. Jordan Warsh, you're not unmuted. All right, I can see there, okay, all right. So let's read line number 1. We have see, say, sigh, show. Okay, line number 2. We have sar, sam, sham, shash, shas. I misread it. Shas, satan, and sarai. Those are interested. Satan becomes transliterated into Greek as Satan. The adversary in the book of Job. Okay, line number 3. We have shoneh. So now let's look at this for a moment. So remember earlier ways of writing, putting the voweling in the printers. They try to save, to a certain extent, space. Here we see there's a dot on the right-hand side and a dot on the left-hand side. Well, the dot on the right-hand side cannot be a vowel. There's no way it can be a vowel on that side of the letter. So that has to be indication that that is the letter shin, the SH sound. And so the other dot is thus the O sound. Okay? Now, often, sometimes dots, as we've come across this before, will have one dot which serves as indicator of the letter and the indicator of the O vowel. And you just have a lot of modern Hebrew printing will have 2 dots or have the dot further over. So you know that's the O, the dot will be right around here rather than over here, between the 2 letters. To tell you it's an O. So this is shoneh. So line number 3, we have the first word is shoneh. Let's do number 2. That's going to be soneh. Soneh. You have to have a vowel, right? Remember, you always have to have a vowel with that first consonant. So that tells us that this has to be both the dot for the sin and the dot for the O. Okay? Just like this was shoneh and this is soneh. Everybody got that, I hope? Okay. So the third word is sameach. Chag sameach, everybody. Okay. Samecha. All right, so these 3 letters, the sin, mem, chet, all have the meaning of joy, rejoicing in some way. That's all those forms. So line number 4, Sarah, Shchenut, Maskoret, Shadchan, and Hiskir. Line number 5, Shava, Sofer, Shituf, Sha'on, Sadeh. Go out into the field, the Sadeh. Okay, line number 6. Ke'asu, Hechelit, She'asa, La'avotechem, Sorek. All right, let's go to the next. Now, we're going to have another S sounding letter, the samach. as you know, in the word nisim up here, notice it's rounded. Let's see. The samach, no, that's not what I wanted, is it? Oh, I know there's a marker here somewhere. Okay, forget it. One of these days I'll learn how to use this thing. Anyway, so the samach, the reason I'm pointing out that curves here, because the final mem is square. If you look here at nisim, in the blessing there at the top of the page, the samach is bigger, so you can see it, but notice it's curved while the final mem is squared. All right. So samach, just like the sin has the sound of S, it's always going to be that. There's no there's no confusion with it. The only thing is you can sometimes mistake it for the final mem. So you have to be careful there. If it curves, there's an S sound to it. You're going to slide off of it. So it's an S. That's one of the trick things. I'll send it out to you if I find the papers. Okay. So line number 1. Sa, sai, su, so, say, se, si, su. Line number 2. Sar, sar, seer, sal, ace, has, dash. Line number 3. Nisim, shas, sham, hasim, tayas, ko-es. Okay, I'm getting some long words here coming up. Line number 4. Matos, samech, sameach, sechach, lehis takel. That's a nice word. All right. And you'll agree with me because hiskim isn't agreed. Line number 5. Hiskim, sika, sicha, steel sail, sandak, sof, sin. Line number 6. Safsal, seret, he speak, sifriya, saif. And line number 7, as we're climbing down the ladder, sulam, shalom, sechar, sukariot, and sukkot. All right. One more letter. All right. The letter is Zion. It has the sound of Z. It's always going to be a Z. You can, if you look at it, the way it differs from the O, right? You have the O letter up here. No, this one has a bulge. It kind of comes on that end of it. Bulges out a little bit. Yeah, all right? That's how it would be written, so you know the difference of it. You're just drawing straight lines. It'll be a straight line with an angle line coming across the top. Okay, it's a Zion, a Z sound, always a Z sound. No changes, nothing, no problems with it. Okay, so line number 1. We have Zu, Zo, Z, Ze, Zay, Sa, Sai, Zu, Do. Line number 2. Zar, Az, Oz, Zan, Ze, Haz. Okay, line number 3. Chazan, Hazeh, Zot, Zahov, Zevach, Zuz. Okay. Line 4. Zigug, Tzion, Zaken, Zakena, Zariz, Mizrach. Okay, line number 5. Zroah, Hizmin, Hazhara, Zemirot, Zaman. Line number 6. Bachutz, Bechorim, Bikur, Boker, Boaz. Right, line 7. Zarak, Sahak, Rotzeh, Razeh, and Zechut. All right. So now, when the first night of the holidays, we always say Shechayanu. And since you now have learned the entire 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet with the plus the ones that have final versions of them, we can say Shechayanu for having reached this moment in our time. So let's read the bracha together. On the middle here, we have Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam Shehechayanu V'kimanu V'higianu Lazman Hazeh. So we thank God for enabling us to reach this milestone in our lives. Okay, mazel tov, everybody. All right, now you can read Hebrew. Slowly, I get it. Yeah. I don't expect you to be doing it, very, very fast, but yeah. Okay. Last week we started talking about rabbinic literature. And I'll be honest, I don't remember where we exactly left off. I'll call up my where is it? You don't need examples. There we go. Let's see, what do I want here? We can get rid of this. I know this is way down. We hadn't gotten to there because you didn't have any Hebrew on the stuff I gave you. All right, well, we had gone through this little bit of the Midrash here. And I just want to review real quickly because we're going to see how the rabbis dealt with the biblical material. All right. So the Mechilta is, and I think we did this last week, didn't we? Yes, no. Shake your head if anybody knows the answer. We did or we didn't? All right, I'll go over it again. All right. The Mechilta de Rabbi Yishmael, as it's called in Hebrew, or the Mechilta of Rabbi Yishmael, is a work of what we call Midrash Halacha, a legal Midrashic collection on the book of Exodus. And in the book of Exodus, we of course beginning to have the mitzvot that are important, the mitzvot in general. So Exodus 12:2 opens up with the words, "This month shall be to you the beginning of months." So as I hinted at last week, the Midrash is usually built on some kind of anomaly, some kind of problem that the rabbis see in the passages in the Bible. You could have said, why does he need to say this month? Well, I could have said, this shall be for you the beginning of months. Okay, so we have the extra month mentioned here. And so the rabbis playing with this, Rabbi Yishmael says Moses pointed out the new moon to Israel. Okay, so Moses points to the new moon and says, Israel, this is what it will look like. Okay, and then Rabbi Akiva said there were three things that Moshe himself could not visualize. In other words, it wasn't just that Israel couldn't understand it, Moses couldn't understand it until it was explained to him by God by pointing him out to him. As Rabbi Akiva says, this was one of the three things that Moses could not visualize until they were pointed out to him by the Lord. Likewise, in Leviticus 11:29, this shall be unclean for you among all things that swarm on the earth. What is this talking about exactly? So God had to explain it to Moses in more detail. And then the work of the menorah, how you made the menorah. And then it says, others say, and this is not unusual in the Midrash, you will sometimes have an alternative or additional explanation of a passage. Others say he was likewise perplexed as to slaughtering. And that's why it says, and this is what you shall do upon the altar. Each case, the language is such that the rabbis saw it as meaning there was more given to Moses, or at least more direction needed for Moses to understand the commandment. So then it finishes up with this statement from Rosh Shema Bar Yochai, were not all the mitzvot spoken to Moses in the daytime? How then could he have pointed out the moon? Now, one of the things we find in Midrash and in the Talmud for that matter, there's sometimes passages that contradict each other or seem to contradict each other. So the rabbis were of the opinion nothing in the Torah, nothing in rabbinic literature could contradict something else. So there's apparently a midrash that said that God spoke to Moses during the daytime to give him the mitzvot. Now the reason for that is that Moses was supposed to be the highest level of prophet, the father of prophets. I mentioned before when we talked about prophecy that most of the prophets, or all the prophets, seem to have their visions at nighttime and dreams. Moses is described as having spoken to God peh al peh, face to face, panim el panim. And so that implies it's during the daytime. So the Midrash wants to say, to support that, all of the mitzvot were given to Moses during the daytime. So therefore, that becomes a contradiction here. How could God point out the moon? So Rebbe Lazar says he spoke with him just before it got dark and showed it to him when it got dark. So God's speaking to Moses as soon as the sun sets. And that's where the new moon is always going to be, right at sunset. So Moses was able to see the new moon just after the sun set. But this is common. If you have a contradiction, the rabbis want to find some way of eliminating that contradiction. Now, following along this, and this is the midrashic treatment of this passage some more. So in Exodus 12:2 says, the beginning of the months. All right, so that's the quote. So the Midrash says, we're hereby apprised that Nisan is the beginning for the months. So what is this telling us? That Nisan, the month of Nisan, whenever we count months in the Bible, Nisan, the month of the Exodus from Egypt, is always counted as the first month. And Rosh Hashanah falls in the seventh month, not the first. Rosh Hashanah, as well, that we celebrate today. So then it says, how do we derive for the reign of kings? How do we understand that this is also the beginning of months of kings? So then it says, you find in 1 Kings 6:1, in the fourth year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is also ER, the second month. All right, so since it says the second month, the rabbis read into this, I'm not sure that's what it really means, but read into it that Solomon's reign as king had begun with the first month of Nisan. We'll come back to this a little bit later when we look at the Mishnah. So this is whence do we derive the same for festivals? And there's this commentary that was built into this passage that I took it from. It says, if you take an oath, a vow, you have a certain length of time to fulfill that vow. So the rabbis understood that you had to fulfill the vow within 3 Yom Tov, 3 consecutive festivals, and they have to start with Nisan. So if you make a pledge after the holiday of Shavuot, you've got over a year, an extra time. You go through the holiday of Sukkot, then you go through the holiday of Passover, then you go through the holiday of Shavuot, and you have to fulfill your vow by the end of Sukkot. So he says, how do we find it? So it says in Sefer Devarim, the festival of Matzot in Nisan, and the festival of Shavuot, and the festival of Sukkot. So because it orders the festivals this way, the rabbis want to say that it's also for vows. And it summarizes it here. We find then that Nisan is the beginning for months, for kings, and for festivals. Rabbi Nathan, Rabbi Tzadok say also for house rentals. So if I'm renting you for the year, the understanding is until the beginning of Nisan. If I rent you a house today is the first day of the first Adar. So we have 2 months of Adar this year because it's a leap year. I'm renting it to you for the year. You only have 2 months. The month of Adar 1, the month of Adar 2. All right, so they're not giving the basis of it, they're just merely saying it. But it says it doesn't apply to counting the years for Shemitah, Yovlot, various kinds of things, and it has a proof for that based on Deuteronomy. Okay. All right, so that is the Midrashic treatment. It always refers back to verses, and it explains how the law can be derived from the biblical passage. Now, return to the Mishnah. Now, the Mishnah is the compilation of the oral law, edited by Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, Rabbi Judah the Prince, as we saw last week, somewhere around the year 200 of the Common Era. He was the Nasi, he was the head of the Jewish community in the land of Israel those days. And so he was responsible for the ordering of the Mishnah. Okay. Again, I took this translation from another source. So what they did in this particular source, it's in, by the way, Sefaria, I've mentioned it to you before, a wonderful online resource for Jewish texts. Okay, so this is from their English translation of the opening chapter of the Masechet Rosh Hashanah. So the bigger heavy print is the actual Hebrew that's in the text. The smaller print is their additions, so it makes it easier to understand. I'm going to skip those unless it's absolutely necessary. Okay, so there are 4 new years. On the 1st of Nisan is a new year for kings and for the festivals. Okay, that's what we just read a minute ago in the Midrash. In the Midrash, I wonder how you knew that. How'd you get that and derive it? Here is just making a statement. This is the law. 1st of Elul is new year for animal tithes. All right, that all shouldn't be that way. Okay, so when an animal was born before that, its tax year was already up. Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon say on the 1st of Tishrei. Now, here we see right away, as we'll see again, the Mishnah does not always tell you what the law exactly is. It's not really a law code because it contains differences of opinion. So right here, we see the statement starts off saying that the first of Elul is the new year for animal tithes, but Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon say it's the first of Tishrei. So we have an argument already in what the law is. On the first of Tishrei is a new year for the years, for calculating sabbatical years and jubilee years, for planting and for vegetables. On the first of Shvat is the new year for trees, in accordance with the statement of Beit Shammai. But Beit Hillel say the new year for trees is on the 15th of Shvat. So once again, an argument. Is it the first of Shvat, which is the school of Shammai says, or is it the 15th of Shvat, which Beit Hillel says? Normally became the practice to follow the interpretations of Beit Hillel versus Beit Shammai. There were two schools. There was Hillel and Shammai were teachers who were contemporaries. They each had somewhat different approach to the traditions, and they had schools of thought that followed them, known as Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. All right. So now I want to turn to the very opening Mishnah. This is the very first Mishnah. And we're going to see how this is treated in some of the later sources as well. We all know that we say the Shema, right? We say the Shema morning and evening. Also, it's a tradition to say the Shema when you go to bed at night. And so the opening of Masechet Barachot, the tractate that deals with blessings and prayers, starts by saying from when one recites the Shema in the evening, right? When do you say Shema at nighttime? So it says from the time when priests enter to partake of their truma until the end of the first watch. That is the statement of Rabbi Eliezer. All right, I'm going to read through all of it, then we're going to go back at it, over it. The rabbis say until midnight. Rabbi Gamliel says until dawn. Okay, so the very opening of the first Mishnah starts with a statement that seems to be unanimous, that you say the Shema from the time the priests enter to eat their truma, whatever that means, because the Mishnah doesn't tell us. But we're going to see later on in the Talmud that they understand that to mean when the stars come out at night. All right, so the beginning time seems to be, you say the Shema in the evening from the time the stars come out. I'm going to translate it that way for a moment. Okay. How late? How long into the night do you have to fulfill the mitzvah of reciting the evening Shema? So the next statement says until the end of the first watch, but it doesn't tell us what a watch is. And it doesn't mean Rolex or something like that. The night is divided into 3 or 4 watches, meaning, guards watching through the night. Again, this is going to be, the Talmud wants to deal with that. And it says that is the statement of Rabbi Eliezer. Now, is it just the last statement until the end of the first watch, or the whole thing? We're not really concerned. Oftentimes, you will find in the Mishnah the statement of one rabbi, and then a statement that says the rabbis say. Sometimes we know what that's meant by the rabbis say. Sometimes we know who they are. Sometimes we don't. Sometimes the Talmud tries to figure that out. Normally, we say that if you have one opinion in the Mishnah versus that is one person giving a position, and you have others, more than one, giving a different position, the law follows the majority. So it follows the Rabbim versus the Echad. One is Echad, Rabbim is the numerous. So usually we would assume if it's a difference of agreement between Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis, the law would follow what the rabbi said. But now we have a third statement. Rabbi Gamliel says until dawn. And then we have something that we don't often find in the Mishnah, a story. Apparently, Rabbi says there was an incident happened. His sons returned from the wedding hall. They'd spent a long time at a wedding. They said to him, "We do not recite the Shema." He said to them, "If dawn has not yet arrived, you are obligated to recite Shema." Okay, he says the obligation really goes until the break of dawn. So you still have to say the Shema because you haven't fulfilled the mitzvah. And then he adds, and not only that, but rather wherever the sages say until midnight, the mitzvah is until dawn. And then he gives a list of things. We're going to skip over that. But at the end, it says, if so, why did the sages say until midnight? In order to distance a person from transgression. If I know I've got all night long to say the Shema, I might wait all night and fall asleep and not say the evening Shema. So the rabbis gave an artificial end time to say the Shema. That's called a gezerah, a fence around the Torah. All right. So we're going to come back to this because I want you to see how the Talmud uses this or understands this in its discussions. So give you other examples of Mishnayot, passages in the Mishnah. Orla Barsar, on the evening of the 14th, we're talking about the month of Nisan, one searches for leavened bread by candlelight. Any place in which one does not take leavened bread does not require a search. And with regard to what they said concerning 2 rows of wine barrels in a cellar, a place into which one takes leavened bread, that's in dispute. Beit Shammai say 2 rows across the entire cellar. Beit Hillel say the 2 external rows, which are the upper ones. We have here something that's not mentioned in the Torah, that we have to search out for our chametz. We're told that you can't have chametz on Pesach, but there's nothing about searching for it. So we're told that you have on the night of the 14th, Passover begins the night of the 15th. You search for leavened bread, and you have to use a lamp, a candle, or something. And if you don't normally take food into it, then you don't have to worry about it. But if you have a wine cellar, which people often took the explanations given that the servers, the maids or the butlers who would bring wine to the meals would often go down and they might be eating a sandwich when they went into the cellar. So they might have had some leaven there, but wherever that be. So Beit Shammai says you have to look at the cost of 2 rows across the entire cellar, the top 2 rows. Beit Hillel says, nah, you don't expect them to have a sandwich way in the back of the cellar where the back rows of the wine casks are. It'll be in the front, the 2 external ones. All right, so this is a ritual. The first Mishnah we read was about saying the Shema, rituals. This also is talking about rituals, but the Torah doesn't just talk about rituals. It talks about laws of everyday life. We saw that last week in Parsha Mishpatim. So one of the first Mishnahs that traditionally done in the yeshiva world is Baba Metzia. Well, it's a section of the Talmud, the middle gate is what it means. We won't go any further, but it talks about lost objects. Who, if I find something and somebody else finds it, we don't know who the owner is. What are our responsibilities? Do we have to return it to the owner? Actually, the answer is yes, if we can ascertain who the owner is. But one of his cases that there's some kind of cloak. Actually, the Hebrew word is used here as talit. Shnaim ochazim betalit. 2 people are holding onto a garment. The wording of the Mishnah is 2 holding a garment. This says, I found it, and that says, I found it. This says, all of it is mine, and that says all of it is mine. Okay, so we have two people holding on to this talit. Now the interpretation here is very much influenced by the Talmud, whoever translated this, because he's assuming that they're in court holding this garment. They have to be holding it, and they go to the court and they're both still struggling over this coat, this talit, when they go before the judges. And what are the claims? There are two claims. They're not exactly the same. One says, I found it, and one says, I found it. All right. So they're arguing who found it. If one says, I found it, he's saying, I found it. Nobody else was there when I found it, or nobody else took it. The other guy says, no, I found it. It's all mine. But the first claimant merely is that I found it, I found it. The second one says, all of it is mine. One of the guys say, no, I found it. He wasn't there. I picked it up and I claimed it. The other one says, all of it is mine. Okay, so it takes the same claim. So what is the court supposed to do? There are no witnesses. How would you decide such a case? So the Mishnah says, what do? First of all, we'll make sure nobody's lying. So they impose an oath. This one takes an oath that he does not have less than half of it. He doesn't own less than half of it. And that takes an oath that he doesn't have half of it, and they divide it. By wording it this way, it's not, we're making sure that nobody is taking we're trying to say that they're not necessarily taking a false oath. It could be they found it simultaneously. And if they picked it up simultaneously, then each has a claim to half of it because they found it together. So they divide it, but they take an oath saying, not that I found all of it, because then we have two contradictory oaths. So instead, they take an oath that doesn't own less than half of it, because he's saying, at least I found it at the same time as the other guy. And maybe that's really the truth. They found it together. That's why they're fighting over it. Okay. So that's one circumstance. Now we have another circumstance in the court in which one claimant is saying, I found it. And the other guy is saying, no, we found it at the same time. Okay. So this says all of it is mine. And that one says half of it is mine. So they're really only arguing over half of the coat. So the one who says all of it is mine takes an oath that does not have less than 3 parts of it. Half of it goes to him, everybody agrees. And so all we're arguing is the second half. So the second half is divided into halves, so 1/4 and 1/4 versus 2 quarters. 3/4 goes to the guy who says, I found it. It all belongs to me. 1/4 goes to the guy who says, no, we found it at the same time. And he takes an oath that not less than 1/4 of it belongs to him. Now, anybody looking at this would not consider this to be any kind of religious discussion. I mean, the previous Mishnah that we looked at, what do you do for Passover? You're getting rid of the chametz from Passover. Okay. The prior one was talking about recitation of the Shema. Again, ritual. So that most people consider that the world of religion. But note, the Mishnah, as the Torah itself, sees all of life as part and parcel of what God wants, how God wants us to live. And so the information is retained in the various areas of life. And in Jewish communities throughout the ages, it was rabbinic courts who decided much of the commercial law for the Jewish community, and disputes and lawsuits and all that sort of thing. And so that is still part and parcel of what one learns when one is trying to understand the full message of Jewish law in Judaism. Okay. Now you remember a few minutes ago, we read the Mishnah that talks about saying the Shema. Okay. It says when you say the Shema at nighttime, and the end, when the priests enter, eat their truma to the end of the first watch, the words of Rabbi Eliezer, the sages say until midnight. Rabbi Gamaliel says until the break of dawn. The Talmud, it begins with the Mishnah. We have the law of the Mishnah, the way the rabbis spoke at that era, up to the year 200, 225. But as we saw, it's not necessarily it's not filled out completely. There may be gaps in what's said in it, and we need to understand what's going on in the Mishnah when it doesn't explain everything. So the role of the Talmud, both the Talmud of the land of Israel and the Talmud of Babylonia, was to look at the Mishnah, analyze it, seek to squeeze every bit of meaning you can out of it. And sometimes they talk about other things as well that get into the discussion. Okay, so once again, this is from Sefaria, which has the intervening extra interpretation. All right, and so it just the heavier print is what is actually in the Talmud. So it says, when do we say the Shema at nighttime? So the Gemara, the Talmud begins, it says, wait a minute, guys. On the basis of what does the Tana say from when? How do you know you say the Shema? It begins by saying when you said the Shema, but it nowhere says you have to say the Shema. What's the biblical basis for saying the Shema? You know, if the Mishnah had opened up and saying the Torah tells you say these words twice daily, all right, then that's why we said the Shema. Okay, but it doesn't do that. All right. So then it goes on to say, furthermore, what distinguishes the evening Shema? That it was taught first. Let the Tana teach the morning first. He says, wait a minute, you know, even though the day begins at sunset, that's how Jewish tradition regards it, you know, normal way we organize our lives is from morning to evening. So we would expect him to start off by saying, what time do you say the Shema in the morning? And only after that would you go on to talk about the evening. So why is it in that order? So the Gemara, the Talmud says the following. The Tana, that is the person who authored this Mishnah, bases himself on the verse that is written. You will talk to them when you sit in your home, or when you walk along your way, and the important part, when you lie down and when you arise, or when you rise up. So the first thing it mentions is when you lie down, that's nighttime. When you arise, that's the morning. So he starts off by talking about the Shema of the evening first, followed by talking about the Shema of the morning. And furthermore, because of the first part of that verse, which the Talmud actually doesn't quote, it says we have to speak of them day and night. So then it says, and based on the written Torah, the Tana teaches the Orwa. When is a time for recitation of the Shema of lying down? So then he now quotes, from when the priests enter to partake or eat their truma. Truma is the gift offering that farmers had to give to the Kohanim when they harvest their crops. All right. So that's why it continues for the evening. All right, that's explaining this passage here. The Tana teaches on time reciting Shema from the time of lying down with the priest entry or truma. He doesn't explain what truma is here, but that's for later on. So now, that's one way of explaining it. The Talmud suggests there may be another way. If you wish, say that the Tana derives the precedence of having the evening first from the story of the creation of the world, as it was written, as I said earlier, there was evening and there was morning one day. So again, evening precedes morning. All right, so we've given an answer that evening always precedes morning. That's why we start with that. So the Gemara says, well, wait a minute. A little bit further on in the Mishnah, we're going to read, after we say the times of the Shema, it says, in the morning, one recites 2 blessings before and 1 blessing afterwards. In the evening, 2 before and 2 afterwards. But based upon what we just said, the Mishnah should have taught about the evening first. The order should have been in the morning. In the evening, one recites 2 blessings before and 2 afterwards. And in the morning, one recites 2 blessings before and 1 afterwards. So how do we understand what's going on here? So the Gemara answers by saying that Tana, the author of the Mishnah, began by discussing the evening and then taught the laws regarding the timing of the morning. And since it's already dealing with the morning, he explained matters of the morning and then explained the matters of the evening. You know, while we're talking about the morning Shema, first we're talking about time. When you say in the evening, when you say it in the morning. Now that I'm talking about the morning, I might as well finish talking about the ritual of the morning Shema. And then I'll go and finish back with the evening Shema. Okay, so we've sought to understand why the Mishnah opens up the way it does. So now I got another question. The master said in the Mishnah, when the priests enter to partake of their truma, when is that? So the Gemara says, the Talmud says, when do priests enter to partake of their truma? From the time of the emergence of stars. All right, Seita Kochavim. The priests, as explained later on, they don't eat the truma until it's clearly nightfall, clearly dark. And how do you know it's clearly nightfall, clearly dark? When you can see the stars. So if that's the case, why does they say from the time the stars come out? Wouldn't that have been simpler? So the Gemara, the Talmud says, he teaches us a matter in passing. When do priests partake of the truma? From the time of the emergence of the stars. All right, so he says, first of all, he tells us the priests enter the truma at the time of the stars. That we derive from that. And he goes on to teach us another law that atonement doesn't rely upon the sacrifice. And we're going to stop here for that. Okay, so this is a typical beginning of a Talmudic tractate, asking questions about the basic meaning, the sources for the Mishnah. Remember, the Mishnah just gave the law as it's found in the oral law. The Talmud seeks to find the basis for it in the written Torah. All right. Now, earlier, we had also mentioned, we talked about Rosh Hashanah, right? 4 Rosh Hashanahs. The Talmud also then discusses that Mishnah. So the Gemara says, New Year for Kings, with regard to what halacha? What is it talking about? So Rav Chisda said it's for determining the validity of documents, as we learned in another Mishnah. Antedated promissory notes are invalid, but post-dated are valid. All right? What's going on? We today, if I write a contract today, February 2nd, yeah, Groundhog Day, okay. By the way, there's no Jewish ritual for Groundhog Day, as far as I know. We date it. We would say February 2nd, 2022, the Common Era. We wrote up this contract. Now, why is it important to have a date in a contract? Well, because let us say I'm taking a mortgage on property. Well, if I'm taking a mortgage, I assume that that mortgage is valid, and if the person doesn't pay back the loan, I can take the property. But what if there's already a lien on the property? I already took somebody took a mortgage out earlier. Which mortgage takes precedence? The mortgage that is earlier. So if I write a promissory note and put the date back, instead of February 2nd, I date it January 31st, that's illegal because maybe, I'm taking away somebody else's validity of a mortgage. So he wants to say, why do we care? Why do we care when the king's rule begins? The year of the king's rule, because in the ancient world, that's how they dated documents. First year of King X, second year of King X, third year of King X. So we're told, as the Talmud explains, that the date of the king's reign begins on the 1st of Nisan, always. So, and as it says, the sages taught in another passage, if a king ascended on the 29th of Adar, okay, this year would be the 29th of the second Adar. Once the 1st of Nisan arrives, a year is counted toward his reign. But if he ascended only on the 1st of Nisan, one counts his reign only when the next Nisan arrives. So here's the kunz, as they say. King George the 17th or 22nd, whatever number King George you want, he becomes king of England on the 29th of the month of Adar. So on the 29th of the month of Adar, I write the first year of the reign of King George, whatever number. The next day, which is the first day of Nisan, I write the second year of his reign. Because the reign starts from the 1st of Nisan. So that we don't really worry about that today in our world, but that's the Talmud explaining the passage. All right? And it gives some examples. Now, I mentioned to you before that there really are two Talmuds. There's the Talmud, Babylonian Talmud, and there's the Talmud of the land of Israel. The Talmud of the land of Israel is much shorter, and it is not as well redacted, edited, but sometimes we can see how it deals with the same material, but differently. So in the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Talmud of the land of Israel, notes the same Mishnah we had before. When does one start to read the Shema in the evening? From the time the priests enter their Truma. Rabbi Chia stated, from the time that people enter their houses Friday evening to eat their meal. He gives a different answer. Not from Truma, but from the time that people on Friday night come to have dinner. So the Talmud there says, we say their opinions are almost identical. So he says, from the time the priests enter their Truma is still daylight, and the stars start to appear. As from the time that people enter the houses Friday evening to eat their meal is 1 or 2 hours into the night. You want to say that two opinions are identical? Because they don't make sense. So Rabbi Yossi said, explain it by people in hamlets and villages who usually leave the roads when there's still some daylight because they're afraid of wild beasts. So here it talks about the fact that people in villages eat their meals right around dusk. Just as the sun is set, stars about to come out. And then we have something here that we're going to see later on. It was stated, who recites the Shema before that time did not fulfill his duty. And if that is so, this is talking about the morning Shema, but if that is so, why does one recite the Shema in the synagogue? Now, what is assumed here and not explained in any detail is that even in their days, we'll see later on, the people often had the evening prayer service and the afternoon prayer service at the same time, right? It's around sunset. And many shuls today, Orthodox, conservative shuls, sometimes have it early, later, we'll touch on that later. But so if you have to say the Shema once after the stars come out, why do you say the Shema in the synagogue before that time? So Rabbi Yossi gives an explanation. One does not recite to fulfill one's duty, but only to stand in prayer after the study of Torah. He says, no, we're not saying the Shema at nighttime in the synagogue prayer service to fulfill the obligation of the Shema, but only so that we can fulfill the idea that when we say evening prayers, or any kind of prayers, there should be words of Torah associated with them. Okay, so those are just a couple examples of what you find in the two Talmuds. Now, I want to continue on with the Talmud, with the commentaries on the Talmud, because they're vital for the development of Jewish law and traditions as well. We've mentioned Rashi before. He's on the sheet I gave you. Rashi is the commentator par excellence on the Talmud. He has commentary on a good portion of the Talmud, and we normally study Talmud with his commentary. And what he does sometimes, or what he does in general, is just try to explain the basic passage that we're looking at. So at the beginning of the Mishnah that we've been talking about, excuse me, where it said in the Mishnah, when the priests enter to eat their truma, Rashi explains what's going on. He says, Kohanim, priests that have become defiled, ritually defiled, and then immersed in the mikveh, and the sun has set, then they're allowed to eat truma. A Kohen the truma is a gift to the Kohanim. As such, the Kohanim have to be in a state of ritual purity in order to eat it. If something happens, say the priest came in contact with a dead body, or some other thing that gives him ritual impurity, he has to wait a certain length of time. He goes to the mikveh. The next morning, he's going to bring a sacrifice. Right? But what Rashi is telling us, that the Kohanim, even though they haven't brought the sacrifice that next morning, once the sun is set, they're allowed to eat the truma. Okay. Then we had it said until the end of the first watch. I mentioned to you, what is the watch? So Rashi fills that in for us. The third is the night, as will be explained in the Gemara. And from then on, the time has passed. For it is not the time of lying down, and is not referred to in the words l'shoch b'cha. Therefore, this period is not considered the time for lying down. Therefore, if one read the Shema before, he does not fulfill his obligation. So Rashi is saying, and telling us here, how do we know you say the Shema? Because it says when you lie down. And when do people lie down? The first third of the night. So according to Rabbi Eliezer, the limitation on saying the Shema is the time that most people go to bed. Most people go to bed at night once it gets dark out. In the ancient world, not a lot of light. The lamps didn't supply a lot of light, so you went to bed early. So he says, so therefore, if you read it before the time the stars come out at night, you have not fulfilled the obligation. By the way, Rabbi Gamliel says not when you go to bed at night, but when people are in bed at night, which means all night long. So then Rashi asks a question, which is not usually the case of Rashi in the Torah here, but it says, the Talmud, if so, why do we read the Shema in the synagogue? When you saw that in the Talmud Yerushalmi, in order to stand in tefillah in prayer, connection with words of Torah is taught in the Brighton and the Jerusalem Talmud Brachot. Therefore, one would have to read again after it gets dark. In this case, reading the first section of the Shema at bedtime suffices. So according to Rashi, if you say the Shema early, when you go to bed, all you have to do is read the first paragraph of the Shema to fulfill the mitzvah of reciting Shema at nighttime. And now he says, as I jumped the gun, until dawn. Remember, Rabbi Gamliel says you can say the Shema until dawn. As Rashi says, the entire night is called the time of laying down. So he explains Rabbi Gamliel's position for us. And then on the basis of what? From where does the Tana conclude the obligation to read Kriyat Shema that he began to ask here at the time of the reading? So this gives us, when you're looking at the Talmud, it gives us explanations that are necessary to help understand what the Talmud is trying to tell us. That's the task of Rashi. But sometimes we will see that not everybody agrees with Rashi. Furthermore, he had, I won't call it family trouble. I'm sure he shept nachas on it. I mentioned last time, I think, that according to the traditional understanding, history, Rashi had 3 daughters, no sons. His 3 daughters, at least 2 of them married rabbinic scholars, and they had sons who were scholars, especially Rashbam Shmuel ben Meir and Yaakov Tam or Yaakov ben Meir. Rashbam Shmuel ben Meir is a bit older than his brother Yaakov. They're both 2 of the first generation of the Balei Tosafot, although their fathers may fall into that category as well. And it was their task, because Rashi had already done the basic legwork, to try and see how what we're learning in this part of the Talmud may fit something else, somewhere else in the Talmud. And as we're going to see here, they're going to argue with their grandfather. All right. When does one recite the Shema, etc.? So that the Tosafot, remember I said the Tosafot are out, Rashi's near the binding, Tosafot are the outside of the binding, right? I always forget myself, so I look at it. Rashi explained, how do we recite the Shema when it's daytime and do not wait until the stars come out? As the Gemara explains, that this is the reason when Kohanim begin to come to eat their truma. For this reason, Rashi explains that the Shema is recited when we go to bed is the primary, and that is after the stars appear. And so it is found in Yerushalmi. If one recites Shema before this time mentioned in our Mishnah, he has not fulfilled his obligation. If so, why do we recite Shema in the synagogue? In order to stand in prayer, having first said some words of Torah. Okay, so he quotes Rashi and explains what Rashi said. But he then goes and says the explanation is bewildering. But the people, when going to sleep, are accustomed to reciting only the first paragraph. And if so, we should read all 3 paragraphs. If we haven't fulfilled the mitzvah, how can we fulfill it with only 1 paragraph? There's another difficulty, that one is required when reciting to also recite 2 blessings before and 2 blessings after at night. Furthermore, the Shema recited when it goes to bed is only because of the mazikim. And if he's a scholar, he doesn't need to do it. The Talmud says, why do you say the Shema when you go to bed? For protection against all kinds of bad demons and bad guys out there in the world. So then the Tosafot goes on to explain, a couple of pages later, there's a dispute between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi about the proper order. When do we say the Shema? There should be some dots here. Something's missing here, but if so, we are ruling in favor of Yeshua ben Levi, says the prayers are in between. Let's skip over that. Anyway, I just want to point out that here you have an attempt to explain what's going on, Tosfos say we're dealing with two different problems, or several problems. So he goes through these and points out the difficulties, and then he says, therefore, Rabbi Yitzchak says that certainly the recital of Shema that we recite in the synagogue is primary. And we who say Mariv prayers while it is still day, we hold like those in the Talmud who say that the day is sanctified also in the time that people enter to recline and eat their meal, which refers to the Shabbos meal. That was while it was still day. From that time on is a time for saying Mariv prayers. There's also proof, there's another proof, but you see, it's a very long discussion in which he comes up with a contradictory to his grandfather, Rashi. All right. Now, if you wanted to know when you said the Shema at night, and you didn't know the law, where are you going to find it? Well, you'd have to know that if you open up the Talmud and turn to the beginning of it, there will be the Mishnah and the discussion. But let's start with the first thing. The Mishnah says from the time the stars come out at night, or from the time the priests enter their truma, and as we see both from Rashi and Tosafot, that's a problem, understanding that, because there's a tradition to say the Shema earlier. Furthermore, how late can you say the Shema? Is it according to Rabbi Eliezer, a third of the night? Is it like the sages until midnight? Or is it like Rabban Gamliel until the break of dawn? Now, after the close of the Talmud, there were different attempts to try and deal with this difficulty. One of the earliest ones is what I like to call a reader's digest of the Talmud. Rabbi Yitzhak Alfasi, who lives in northern Africa, it's called Alfasi because it comes from Fez, tried to edit the Talmud to have only the passages that dealt with the law. But nonetheless, there's still going to be give and take, and it's not always clear what the law is. So Moses Maimonides, the Rambam, Moshe ben Maimon, 11th century, decided that this is a big problem. You didn't know what the law was, you didn't know how to find the law. Not everybody was able to go to the Talmud and look it up. So he decided he was going to create a law code. And he says explicitly in his introduction that his purpose was so that you could know the law without having to look at the Talmud. If you have a question, it's all organized. You know where to look up you want to know about the laws of the Shema? Well, you can turn to the chapters that talk about the Shema. Hilchot Kriyat Shema. So I didn't put it in English here, but it's chapter 1 of the laws of the Shema, laws or paragraphs 9 and 10. So this is what Maimonides said. When is the time for reading the Shema? In the evening, the duty is correctly performed if it is read at any time from the first appearance of the stars till midnight. Because if you want to do it the right way, you do it between the time the stars come out at night and before it is midnight, celestial midnight. If one, however, transgressed and delayed, but read the Shema before daybreak, he has discharged the obligation. So he says, whatever reason you decided to delay it and you didn't read it until just before daybreak, but dawn, then you fulfilled your obligation. The sages fix midnight as a limit only in order to prevent complete violation. Then he goes on to say in the next paragraph, one who reads evening Shema after dawn, but before sunrise, has not discharged his obligation unless he had been unavoidably prevented from reading it earlier. as for instance, he had been inebriated or sick, etc. Anyone who unavoidably delays reading the Shema till this time does not recite the blessing, beginning causes to lie down in peace. So Maimonides in these two paragraphs says, when should you start saying the Shema? At nighttime? When should you what is the end time for saying the Shema at nighttime? What happens if some kind of interference comes in and if you want to say the Shema, can you say the Shema? Do you say all the blessings? All right, so that's his thing. Maimonides' Mishnah Torah is a tremendous work. It's 14 volumes, or 14 sections, Yad HaChazakah. And in it, he covers all of Jewish law, everything. Laws of kings, laws dealing with kashrut, laws dealing with ritual purity, all those things. Now, he was attacked by some of his contemporaries precisely for doing what he said he was going to do. Eliminate the give and take, just give you the law. As the Ravid, Avram ben David's, his major opponent, says, before you, people would write, this is what Rabbi X said, and this is what Rabbi Y said, and this is why I think it should be this way. But you just say what you think it is. How do I know I should rely on you? And my mind would say, yeah, because you're relying on me. So immediately after the Mishnah Torah was written, there were debates, and already people began to write commentaries on it, explaining what the Maimonides meant as time went on. Now, a few generations later, we moved from Egypt, which is where Maimonides was, to Spain. And Yaakov ben Asher, Yechiel ben Asher, the son of one of the last of the Balei Tosafot, who began in France and fled one of the Crusades and ends up in Spain at that time, before the expulsion of Spanish Jewry. So his son writes what he called the Arba Turim, or the Four Pillars. In 4 volumes, he tries to deal with the laws that are applicable in our day and age, and bringing Maimonides up to date, along with some other sources that relies on. But you'll see his approach is somewhat different in language and style to what Maimonides did. So this is my poor translation of it. And when is the time for reciting the Shema? At night, as it is taught in the Mishnah when the priest enters to eat their truma, that is when the stars come out. So wrote Rav Alfas, and so wrote Palti, who I think was one of the Gaonim. One who recites the Shema before he saw 3 stars, if he intended thus, he has not fulfilled his obligation, and he must return and recite the Shema and pray. All right, so he says, if you intended to do this and you were trying to say the Shema, but you did it early, you're out of luck, Charlie. Then he says, if he did not intend to do so and erred, in other words, he thought it was later than it was, and prayed, he doesn't return and pray. Yeah, after the fact, okay, you're all right. And so wrote Rav Amram, who I know is a Gaon. And even if he recited during the twilight period, which is uncertain day or night, there is in the Yerushalmi that he returns and recites it. So he says, if it's in that period of time when we're not sure if it's day or night yet, you have to repeat it. And so he explained Rashi that the time is from when the stars come out. And he wrote, that which we recite in the synagogue, we do not fulfill our obligation, except that which we recite at bedtime, and that which we recite in the synagogue is only so we can pray in the midst of Torah study. And Rabbeinu Tam wrote that certainly that of the synagogue is essential for reciting it with its blessings. As for reciting before the stars come out, is because the established law in accord with Rabbi Yehuda says that the time for the afternoon service is until an hour and a quarter before sunset, And from that time on is considered evening as far as the afternoon prayer. In other words, you can't say the afternoon prayer anymore. And this is law in regards to recitation of Shema. From then on is its time. So he seems to say, although he gives different opinions, that as long as it's after an hour and a quarter before sunset, if you say the Shema then, okay. A few generations later, we have what is usually called the Shulchan Aruch of Yosef Karo. Karo was a Sephardi Jew. He lives in Tzfat in Israel. He was in the circle of mystics at that time. His book, his work, comes out at a time when publishing is really getting to be very much available, the print and press and the movable type. And so his book becomes very, very popular, but he gives a law in accordance with the Sephardic practice. So Rabbi Moses Isserles, who is a rabbi who lives in Krakow, Poland, he writes a number of addenda to what Karo said, giving the Ashkenazic version where there was a difference. And so here we see how he words it. So this is what we read in the Shulchan Aruch. The time for reciting the Shema is from the time three small stars appear. So he's already adding in here something we haven't seen. That is not just stars, but they have to be somewhat fainter. It makes it darker. And if it is a cloudy day, one should wait until he has no doubts. If he read prior to this time, he returns and recites it without its blessings. So now then he says, if the community recites the Shema when it is yet day, see, it's very clear that the synagogues didn't always operate according to what most of the great scholars thought they should be doing. So the community recites the Shema when it's yet day, meaning it's around sunset, but before the stars come out. He should read Shema with his blessings and pray with them. And when the proper time is reached, he should recite the Shema without blessings. Okay, that's Yosef Karo, the Sephardi. The addendum, the Haggah of Rabbi Moses Isserles says, nonetheless, he does not return and pray at night. That is after the appearance of three stars, even though the community prays quite a bit before night, unless he's accustomed to be stringent in other areas, for then it doesn't appear to be haughty when he repeats the evening prayers. He says, no, we don't say you have to repeat the evening prayers. To repeat them is saying you're a real tzaddik, you're a real chassid, and that's like being haughty. Finally, I just want to conclude with one final section. There's a work called the Kitsu Shulchan Aruch, the abbreviated Shulchan Aruch. It was written in the 19th century in Hungary. When people tell you they read something in the Shulchan Aruch, and they're not a scholar, they don't know much in the way of Hebrew, they read the English. Well, it used to be they were reading English, the Kitsu Shulchan Aruch, because that was all that was around. So he writes, the beginning of the Kriyat Shema period of the Mariv prayer is when three small stars become visible. On a cloudy day, one should wait till the doubt leaves his heart. That is certainly as after nightfall. Nowadays, it is customary for the congregation to pray Mariv immediately after Mincha, even if it is not yet night, in order not to burn the congregation. For it is a burden for the congregation to gather a second time. This should not be done before Plag HaMincha, an hour quarter before sunset. Fortunate is the one who prays Mariv with the congregation after nightfall, and between Mincha and Mariv engages in the study of Torah, so he joins night and day with Torah. According to Kabbalah, Magen Avraham, this is a significant matter. At any rate, it is fitting for any God-fearing person who prayed with the congregation before nightfall not to eat a meal before nightfall. He should wait immediately after the stars appear. He should read the three chapters of Kriyat Shema, then eat his meal. And next week I will look. We'll take a look at a couple of other things from Isaac Klein and talk about the responsive literature and then we'll continue on. Okay. I know it's a little bit long again tonight, and I know it's quite a lot of stuff. But again, I want you to have the feel to understand. You have a development. You have the Torah itself and the laws of the Torah. Alongside the written Torah, you have the oral Torah. That oral Torah seems to sometimes add to what's in the written Torah. Sometimes it elaborates on what's in the written Torah. Traditional theology was that God gave both Torahs to Moses and Sinai. As time went on, need was felt to organize this oral law in different ways. One way was the midrashic manner, in which it was a running commentary on the passages of the Torah. Another way, which finds its way into the Mishnah, was to just list laws, not really quite listing laws, but just give the basic law without the biblical justification for it. That was found wanting a few generations later, and the Talmud is born. The Talmud discusses what's found in the Mishnah, elaborates on it, tries to find the basis for many things. When there are anonymous things in the Mishnah, they don't know who the rabbis who said it. They try to identify the rabbi who said it. They try to deal with issues that have come up, how it fits in with what the Mishnah and the Torah had to say. And then they talk about other things. And in the course of the discussions, they get all over the place, all over the map. All right. Just the other day, there was just in the discussion about what one is allowed to do on the intermediate days of a holiday. So there's a passage in which says a certain rabbi's wife put on makeup. Okay? It says women are allowed to put on makeup. But his wife put on makeup. She's already a grandmother. That doesn't mean very old in those days. She could have been 22. Who knows? 30. So anyway, so she puts on makeup. This other rabbi says, "Wait a minute. This is for the girls, the little girls who are looking for husbands, what have you, or they're just married and they want to make sure their husbands are really into them." But it's not right for your wife to be putting on makeup. So he responds and says, women like to put on makeup. They like to go to weddings. They enjoy themselves. Even if they're hovering at the grave, they enjoy going to a wedding, and you're going to get all for pish to go to the wedding. All right? Hardly a significant discussion, although it has interesting aspects to it. Or elsewhere, we will find discussions about medical remedies. And the Tosafot already in the Middle Ages basically say, don't try this at home. Because they know that a lot of the medical remedies that the Talmud advises, they don't seem to work and they're stuck. What are you going to say? So they say, well, the world has changed since the days of the Talmud. And then sometimes there's midrashic stuff on other things as well. And I say all kinds of things can get dragged into it. By the way, don't tell anybody I told you this. Let me see. Hold on a second. Yeah.
Bees were living in this trash bin, and I was called to remove them. At first, I only saw one piece of comb.
I discovered something out of all places on TikTok. So I'm trying to find that for you. Texas bee workers, where is? I have to find this thing. Oh, I know what. There we go. I only started yesterday. Okay. There is, what is it called? I'll have to send you. It's a young lady, former very religious woman, who gives a Daf Yomi, the daily Talmud passage, very irreverent, lots of four-letter words, but I learned to understand that that's not very unusual for people of your age these days. But what's amazing is with all of that, she does do a good summary of what's taking place in the Talmud, and she gives a good take on that story of the makeup. What is it? All right. Her name, Miriam Ann Zovin, Miriamanzovin. I'll send it out to you if you're, but don't tell any of the rabbis that I gave you this information. They may not appreciate it, but I find it cute. Blasphemous maybe, but cute. Okay, so the problem though with the Talmud is that it's not easy to get through. It's written in Aramaic. A lot of it's Aramaic along with Hebrew. And so not everybody could really find what they needed. Maimonides comes along and in very straightforward, very good, clear Hebrew. The language is accessible to anybody who has a fair level of Hebrew knowledge. And he makes it into a code, telling what the law is without the give and take, without the saying this guy says it this way, this one says it this way. He says, this is what it is, take it or leave it. And some people said, I'll take it. And some people said, I'll leave it. But he set the pattern. Those that come after him and the law codes that follow are a little more prepared to offer the give and take, but still without the full-fledged breadth the Talmud has. What they do are interested in what the law is. You won't find stories about rabbis arguing on whether or not their wives should be putting makeup on during the week, the weekday part of the holiday. It will give you the law whether they're not allowed to do so, but he won't give you that give and take argument. What I want to talk about next week is what we call responsive literature, or Hebrew, the tshuva literature, which is the give and take, the answering of questions that come up. And I hope to have some examples for you for them. So unless there's any questions that anybody has. Again, like I said, the most important thing is that you just have an understanding. Garen, Heather, she is fantastic. Okay, you've seen them before, Heather? Right.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, so I'll blame it on you.
Please.
All righty, but and like I say, it's always a work. Jewish law is constantly a work in progress. It has to deal with new things that come up, and that's where the responsive literature really takes its place. Okay, no questions? All right, everybody, I'll say good night. Have a wonderful weekend. Stay out of the snow tomorrow. I don't know what it's going to be like tomorrow. My poor sister from Florida, North Florida, says they went through winter. And I say, what winter did you have this week? That's the springtime in Toronto. But, what can you do? All righty. Good night, everybody.